Okay, hi everyone, and welcome to our live Q&A on recycling. I'm Emily Chung. I'm a science and technology reporter for CBC News, and I'm here with Dr. Lakhan, who's a researcher at York University's Department of Environmental Studies and an expert in recycling. We're here to answer your questions on recycling, so we're really looking forward to them. This is kind of a special Q&A for CBC News because it's the first one we've done live on Facebook in a closed group, and that group is our Reduce, Reuse, Rethink group on recycling, and it goes with our Reduce, Reuse, Rethink series where we're really exploring recycling and where it's going, and there's been a lot of really interesting discussion there, so we know a lot of you have a lot of questions and we're really looking forward to them. In fact, we actually already, and if you're not in the Facebook group, you can also follow along on YouTube. But please, if you're not on the Facebook group, feel free to join at any time. Just to start off, we already got some questions in the Facebook group. We were asking before we started this Facebook Live for anyone to suggest topics. And one of the things that Katrina McGuire was interested in was what kind of research Cal is doing. And some other people have also asked questions about some of those topics already, so maybe we'll start with that. Leslie Stone asked what is being done to improve recycling in apartments and condos, and Rahul Mehta also asked about improving recycling or barriers to recycling for marginalized people, including lower income residents. And I know that's an area that you've done some research in, so maybe you could talk a bit about that.
Sure. So I think the topics about multi-residential recycling and socioeconomic inequality and marginalized groups, they intersect to a degree. The reason being is that the primary determinants of recycling participation surround convenience, accessibility, and awareness. So in multi-residential buildings, there are a number of endemic barriers that kind of prevent participation. The first being convenience. So a lot of multi-residential buildings, particularly in Toronto, are not equipped with floor-level recycling chutes. So for those of you that live in buildings, you might have to take your recyclables down to the basement or to a waste room, and it makes it slightly more difficult to participate. The second issue about accessibility. So particularly in lower income buildings, even though they might have waste rooms, they may not be clean, well lit, safe. There's a lot of illegal dumping that transpires in these buildings, and the building supervisors have to be really committed to work with their residents to ensure that these spaces are kept clean and accessible. So the fact that a lot of lower income groups are almost being prevented from recycling because even though there might be a waste room, there is still a number of physical barriers to participation. And then the last issue is around awareness. So for single family households in Toronto, at least most of us, we have curbside collection. So every week we have a recycling truck that comes by, we put our goods out at the curb, and most people participate that way. And that also cultivates awareness amongst the consumers because it's a fixed schedule. For multi-residential buildings, it's a lot more amorphous. It's like a lot of times different buildings have different recycling programs, also in terms of whether they accept organics, recycling, and garbage, where it should go. And that difficulty in communicating about what actually goes where and which buildings are offering what service kind of serves as an impediment to participation because a lot of people just simply lack the awareness of what's actually going on.
Okay. And you've also looked a little bit at how different groups, the awareness of recycling among different groups as well?
Yeah, so one of my lines of research is like the role of race and ethnicity as antecedents to recycling behavior, which is like a giant mouthful, but it's basically why do different cultures participate in recycling and what are their attitudes towards recycling? And so I want to qualify that by saying it's not a value judgment when I say a certain minority group participates at a lower rate than, say, for example, first generation Canadians. But what I mean by that is a lot of people come from countries where recycling has never existed. And so the example I like to use is the Mobius loop. So the little 3 arrows we see in all over recycling bins, I had it tattooed onto my forearms. We assume that that's a universal symbol of recycling. But for 60% of new Canadians, they have no idea what that symbol means. And so it's just one of those issues where if you're coming from a country that doesn't have a mature, articulated waste management system, to come here and participate is a completely new experience, and oftentimes it touches upon the issues of awareness again.
Okay. Oops. We got a comment from, hold on a sec here. Oh no. Sorry, my phone needs me to unlock it. Hold on. We have a comment here from Mazvidas Barkovicius, who says, I think people should pay more for general trash and not pay for recycling. What do you think about that?
Well, it's a bit of a misnomer to say that people directly pay for recycling. And so without getting into the complicated financing of the recycling system, so at present, municipalities pay 50% of the program. And so I suppose in an indirect way that's passed on to the consumer in the form of property taxes. And the other 50% is paid for by packaging producers. And so they normally build that into as a fee to participate. In the absence of paying for that system, whether it be the household or the packaging producer or the municipality, the recycling system wouldn't exist. So it's actually really imperative that there be a financing mechanism to ensure the ongoing sustainability of that recycling program. But I really do agree with him when he says that it should be more expensive for people to throw away things in the landfill or in the garbage. Because right now it's simply too easy for me to dump all of my waste in the garbage bin and completely forget about it. And municipalities that implement something called pay-as-you-throw, where the more garbage bags you put out, the more you pay, have had a lot of success in discouraging waste and decreasing waste generation.
Yeah, and that it does vary a lot from province to province how much people pay for garbage versus recycling too, doesn't it?
Very much, even within the same province. So Toronto might have a really sweet deal with a landfill because they have economies of scale, and whereas the North Bay might be paying a lot. So a lot of what dictates our price to send things to landfill is actually our proximity to American markets. A lot of our waste gets exported to Michigan and New York State, and so based on where you are in the province, you might actually have very preferable costs when it comes to landfilling, or alternatively very high costs.
Okay, and Ned mentions, I was surprised by the difference in recycling in the West versus the East, and I think this speaks to some of those barriers as well. In Alberta, they recycle more plastic than New Brunswick from what they've seen, not to mention New Brunswick, I'm not sure whether he's saying Alberta recycles more or less plastic than New Brunswick, but mentions that New Brunswick pays less. So, one thing that's come up a lot is a lot of people are wondering why we don't ban certain types of plastic. David Stewart says, for a lot of goods, I feel it's crazy that we don't ban certain packaging outright. It's better to solve the problem upstream versus downstream, so to speak. But I imagine that's probably harder than it looks, eh?
It's enormously difficult because then you're somewhat intervening in market mechanisms. So the decision to use a certain material for a packaging type is driven by producers. So it's like the Nestle's of the world who decide where they want to put their products. And a lot of times they make those decisions based on a number of factors, not just about its ability to recycle, but how long does it stay in a store shelf? Is it durable when it gets transported? So preventing companies or manufacturers from producing a certain type of package specifically for the reason that it can't be recycled would be met with a significant amount of resistance. So while I agree with the sentiment behind it, this idea that we should be discouraging people from using non-sustainable packaging choices, its implementation would be enormously challenging.
Mm-hmm. Oh, Ned just clarified that Alberta recycles more types of plastics than New Brunswick. I actually have seen comments that New Brunswick's recycling is not very developed compared to the rest of the country.
I think, I don't like to use the term as like one is like less developed than the other. I think it exists along a continuum. So different parts of the country are at different stages in like how they recycle waste, their legislation, their infrastructure. So Ontario and BC, we've had the oldest program. So we've learned from our mistakes, we kind of figured out what's going on. And so New Brunswick and some other provinces that have only recently adopted recycling systems for printed paper and packaging, they have to figure out what works for them. And what works in one province may not work for all.
Okay. Now, William Pitcher asked, is there any move to create provincial standards? It would help with increasing awareness. And in fact, we had another comment from someone else earlier who asked about the possibility of national standards even.
There's certainly an appetite and interest to create a harmonized standard across provinces. So the Canadian Council of Ministers of Environment, so CCME, they represent all of the provincial bodies from each province, and then they do provide input regarding waste management legislation. But ultimately, it's the province who gets to decide what type of program they would like to implement. And because of different infrastructural differences, demographic differences, it would be very challenging to have like a universal program that applies to all provinces. But I think increasingly, if there is a national narrative, it would be that we're shifting the responsibility financially and physically onto packaging producers through EPR.
Okay. And what is EPR, just for people who've never heard that term before?
So EPR, or Extended Producer Responsibility, is when the producer of a packaging is physically and financially responsible for its end of life. So if I'm Coca-Cola and I put a Coke can onto the market, therefore I'm not only responsible for the time it gets sold and you drink it, but I'm also responsible to make sure that that Coke can gets collected in a recycling program and gets recycled in a sustainable way.
Okay, now Stephanie Duvaz is asking a little bit more about that. She says, what can be done to make corporations more responsible and accountable? And I think you're doing some research into this as well, eh?
Very much so. So ultimately what will dictate producer behavior will be financial incentives or disincentives. And a lot of people don't actually really like to characterize it that way because we'd like to hope that packaging companies will do things for altruistic motives or for the environment. But ultimately they do things that help their bottom line, and I just have to kind of say the truth there. And there's a number of factors that go into why they do what they do. So if we're going to encourage packaging producers to make more environmentally sustainable and sound choices, there has to be a severe penalty, probably in economic terms, that discourages them from using non-recycling packaging.
All right, and that would probably cost more and might discourage companies from setting up in certain places, which I guess jurisdictions don't really like to make happen.
It is the constant balancing act between environmental objectives and economic objectives that I think all provinces and jurisdictions around the world struggle with. So EPR for printed paper and packaging in the United States has not happened in any state, specifically because of that reason, that they feel it will pose too much of a financial burden onto industry, and industry will just pack up and leave to a more amenable jurisdiction. And for as much as you'd like to think that's an empty threat, there has been instances that companies have left the province because of EPR legislation. Heinz, at least based on their public statements, said that if Ontario transitioned to a full EPR system, they would leave, and that's exactly what they did. So there are not just environmental consequences to the choices that we make, but there's also severe economic choices. And I don't think there's really a right and a wrong answer. It depends on what side of the coin you're on.
Okay. Now, just to remind everyone who's joining us now, we're doing a live Q&A on recycling, and you can ask questions either via Facebook or via YouTube, and we'll be answering them for the next little bit. I'm Emily Chung with CBC News, and this is Cal Lakhan from York University's Department of Environmental Science. Environmental Studies. I'm so sorry about that. Yeah, so some of the other questions that people have been asking about include, this is one, whenever I do a story about recycling, I tell people I'm doing stories about recycling. One of the things people always ask me is our stuff really getting recycled? Like, how much of it is really recycled and turned into new things as opposed to ending up in the dump? And we actually had a question about that from, let's see, Claire Sullivan. And she was wondering about contamination rates and how much ends up in the dump.
So that's somewhat of a complicated question because it depends on where you measure the recycling rate. So in Ontario, we count anything that is baled, meaning it's gone through a sortation center and turned into a giant cube, as being recycled. However, there is a residue loss that occurs at both the recycling facility, at downstream when they reprocess it. So even though, say, all Ontarians produce 100 tons of a specific type of waste and that's what they put in their blue bin, what actually will make it through the MRF might only be 80 tons, and what actually gets recycled into a new good might only be 70 tons. So there are natural losses that just occur through like regular processing stages that you can't avoid. But the issue of contamination is a slightly different one, because that means there's material that's ending up at the recycling center that doesn't belong, meaning that it's non-recyclable. And that's actually one of the most enormous challenges for municipalities across Canada, is that increasingly contamination rates are going up because of the proliferation of lightweight packaging, and it's incredibly difficult to sort that material out of the MRF. And ultimately, not only does it end up in a landfill, but the financial cost of actually just getting that stuff out of the recycling system is enormous.
Yeah, the City of Toronto mentioned that to me. They said, you're basically paying for it twice. You're paying like twice to handle the garbage, once as recycling, and then you pay to handle it again as garbage.
Exactly. Yeah.
So that's not ideal.
Not at all.
But it sounds like from what I've heard, there's a big difference between what's considered contamination in different places, and it depends on the type of recycling system too, right? Like Toronto, it's all one bin, and Toronto has a huge problem with recycling, but that's not as big a deal in places that sort it more. Is that?
Yeah, so without going into like excessive technical detail, we have different types of recycling systems for municipalities. So single stream mean that it all goes into one bin. And so the opportunity for contamination is very high. So as an example, if I only drink half of my juice and I throw it in the blue bin and there's paper in there and the juice spills all over it, it ruins the paper. There are programs that implement what they call dual or multi-stream recycling. So they have a separate cart for paper, a separate cart for plastics. So that actually significantly reduces contamination, but it also impedes behavior. So when people are forced to like do multiple sorts to figure out what's my newspaper, what's my plastics, what's my metal, it discourages participation. And single stream recycling historically has much higher recycling rates just based on the sheer volume that goes through it.
Okay, but when I talked to BC, one of the things they mentioned was that it doesn't seem to affect their rates. Like, what are they doing right? That like it sounds like a lot of municipalities like Vancouver, you actually have to do quite a lot of sorting, but they still have, they say, pretty high recycling rates.
So I think that kind of rests in like the cultural attitude towards recycling. So I don't necessarily want to say BC is more progressive and more willing to participate. I think all Canadians are very amenable to recycling, but we've historically grown up in a time where I put it in my blue bin and I forget about it. So the idea of doing additional sorts would probably take time to overcome, because it's already seen as a slightly inconvenient activity, and to add additional layers, is kind of a big ask of the consumer. But with that being said, it doesn't mean that it's not possible. I think that where BC has been really successful is communicating why they're asking their households to do those multiple sorts and the success of doing so. So I can see all provinces achieving that level of sortation by households, but it also depends on the configuration of the recycling center. So depending on whether you have a dual stream system or single stream system, the MRFs are completely different. So there's already an existing amount of capital in place that they might not just be able to use.
Okay. I mean, that's sorting at home, but then of course, a lot of us spend a lot of time out and about. Like, we go to work, we go to the food court there, and then the recycling rules are completely different. And John Mills, I think, was the person who wrote in. He said, the biggest issue with recycling, especially with multi-stream bins in public, is getting people to put waste in the right container. Even myself, as someone who pays close attention to this, sometimes finds it difficult to know what goes where. Plastics are especially confusing, as not all can be recycled depending on the region. Have any methods been established in any jurisdictions that are proving to be successful, especially like with those public bins where the rules might be totally different than the ones at home? So
that is like $1 million question in terms of public space recycling. And so historically the solution has been to use the tri-stream bins, where you have one for fiber, one for plastics, one for metals. Unfortunately, and a lot of people don't realize this, the design of the bin actually significantly influences whether a person participates or not. So what I mean by that is there's a natural inclination for people to throw their waste in a space that has the largest opening. So we did a lot of work regarding what type of bins are most effective. And what we discovered is that because waste often has the largest opening and it's a split-second decision as to whether I'm going to recycle or not, they just toss it in the spot that has the biggest opening. So a lot of municipalities thought that by restricting openings you reduce contamination, but not many people want to stop and fit their Coke can through that small little circular hole. So when you do get people to participate, it's great. But in a majority of instances, I would say that open mouth waste bins are where most material ends up. And also public space recycling is not paid for by producers. So municipalities have to not only manage that material, they're paying 100% of the cost for doing so.
Okay, that's interesting. We have a couple other questions here. Kathy Gibson Whitcomb asks, do you believe that consumers have the power by refusing to purchase overpackaged products to exert a deterrent economic cost on producers?
They have the power in theory. I don't know whether it'll actually be put into practice. And I don't say that to be nihilistic or I'm being a bit tongue-in-cheek. But the reality is that a lot of the packaging choices that we have are convenience-based packaging. So the fact that we like our fast food takeout containers, we like the fact when you order something on Amazon, it gets shipped in like 5 different boxes to make sure the product doesn't get damaged in transport. So it's one of those things where if you ask people, would you be willing to change your purchasing decisions to support a more recyclable system? They'd say, of course I would. But then putting it into practice, there's been a lot of evidence to say that there's a disconnect between what people say they're going to do and what they actually do. Right. And I'd like to think that over time people will do the right thing, but so far the data doesn't really reveal that.
And I guess the packaging producers don't necessarily know, like when people are declining to buy certain products, whether it's because of one factor or the other,
Yeah, it would be very, it would require a certain set of conditions. So the example I'd like to use is the coffee pods. So it's not like there's a suitable alternative to coffee pods that are a sustainable packaging choice that's easy to recyclable. Right now, if you want to use your Keurig, you're kind of stuck with only one type of packaging. So in order for that system to work, where you choose alternatives that will encourage producers to change what they're doing, you need a sustainable and viable alternative. And so a lot of products that get put in stand-up laminate pouches or the coffee pods, they just don't have an adequate substitute in terms of recyclable material.
Okay. Now, Lavinia Churito asks, if producers are being held responsible and have to pay for disposal, what about purchases from out of the country? Would they fall under that jurisdiction as well, or will this only hurt Canadian companies?
So the way the current system works is the first importer, so even if it's not made in Canada, so any company that imports their product, whether it be the completed product or pieces, has to pay a fee on that. So it's not just something that's specifically placed on Canadian companies, it's placed on anybody who wishes to sell in Canada. What becomes slightly more complicated is if somebody, as a private consumer, brought something into the country, like on a trip to Florida, I came back and I brought like a TV with me, but I throw it out in a Canadian landfill, then it's Florida that should have paid the fee, but it's Canada that will pay the cost of recycling.
Well, hopefully that kind of thing is a relatively small component.
Yeah, I don't think it's ever been quantified as a material factor.
We have a question from Sam who asks, what are the worst Canadian cities or municipalities for recycling?
I don't like to use the term worst, and I really don't think that there are municipalities that are doing things deliberately badly. What a lot of people don't realize is that a lot of the recycling system is beyond the control of the municipality. So Toronto gets picked on a lot, even within our own industry, because they say, oh, you know, your multi-residential recycling rate's really low, the costs are going up. But it's largely because there's situation-specific factors to Toronto that are beyond their control. And so, yes, they have a lower recycling rate than their peers, yes, they have higher costs than their peers, but it's also because the infrastructure of the city, the demography of the city, what's getting sold into the city is so radically different than everybody else. So I think in most instances, municipalities do what they can with the resources they have available to them. And I cannot think of a single example where municipalities deliberately performing badly and just has like a willful disregard for sustainability.
Right, and I know I've talked to some municipalities who are more recently developed their recycling programs, and they have their own challenges. Like, for example, some of the markets for the recyclable goods are already locked up by other municipalities and they can't find a place to sell them, or they need to find a way to pay for this, but they don't want to boost property taxes, so then they need to find some way to pay for recycling. It's a new service. It's
a system where, whether you're right at the beginning, meaning you're having to develop the infrastructure and the market and this whatever goes in place for a recycling system, or even if you're at the end, you have a mature recycling system, they all face various challenges.
Yeah.
And I don't think there's going to ever be a single instance in which a municipality can implement a recycling program and say, I did that easily. There's so many site and situation specific factors that there's hundreds of variables they have to consider, but I think that, they really are trying to do a good job and provide households with the opportunity to recycle.
Okay. Now, Evelyn Pendle asked, can you be more specific about what is contamination? How clean does your stuff have to be? Now, my understanding is that actually depends very much on the municipality, like what's considered contamination. I think in single stream systems, even a little bit can wreck the paper, right? And
very much so.
Yeah.
So any sort of residual fluid, the inside of a yogurt container, if that gets on the fibers, in all likely it's not going to be recycled, or it's very difficult. So increasingly recognizing that it's going to be difficult to reduce contamination, there are some investments being made at the sortation level, so at the recycling facility, to see if there are ways to overcome and screen contamination. But at this juncture, really the onus is placed on households to make sure that if you put your spaghetti sauce bottle in the blue bin, wash it out. If you have a drink container, empty it out.
Sorry, I don't know where that came from. So Ed asks, how much water is wasted cleaning items that only get put into landfills because of incorrect recycling?
Unfortunately, I don't think anybody has specifically quantified that, at least not to the best of my knowledge. But I think it's something that people should consider, that it's not just, the environmental consequence is not just something ending up in a landfill. Whatever resources we have to employ to make something recyclable or sort it, and if it ends up in a landfill, we have to be considerate of, because the environmental system is not just about carbon or not just about reducing virgin production. It's about all potential environmental metrics that can be impacting the system.
Okay. Now, Katrina McGuire just wanted to refer back to a comment you made about the coffee pods and there not being a lot of other alternatives if you have a Keurig coffee maker. She says that Keurig machines actually have refillable pods, which I didn't know.
I did not know that. So I think that's a fantastic response, but ultimately the packaging at its end of life can't be recycled under conventional means. So I would be really heartened to see if there was a recyclable coffee pod that people could switch into. That'd be fantastic, but this is a great first step.
Okay, cool. Oh, James Snetzinger says, I'm watching this Q&A with 60 grade 1 kids from Thorncliffe Park Public School. All of them agree the world needs to be healthy. Why do many adults act like they don't understand this?
I think many adults, or many people in general, actually don't really understand how the recycling system works. And I've been in this space for a little bit more than 10 years now, and I'll be very honest with you that when I was a student in university, all I ever thought about, I put it in my blue bin and then I shrugged my shoulders and that was it. So to understand where that material goes, who's paying for it, does it end up in a landfill, does it end up in as a recycled material? These are things that aren't readily communicated to the public for a number of reasons. Most municipalities don't even really know what's happening to it. And I think beyond that, there's also, Canada is such a unique and diverse and growing country. And going back to a point Ed made earlier, is that a lot of new Canadians come from countries that have never participated in recycling initiatives. And so what you see is that their children who are born here or spend a significant amount of their life here, they recycle. But their parents who grew up in, say, India or Guyana, which is where I'm from, there's never been an opportunity to recycle, and it's very much a foreign concept.
Okay, well, I mean, one of the things that people have mentioned a lot in our Facebook group is that a lot of people think it might be a good idea to start teaching recycling and this kind of environmental literacy in schools.
I think that's a fantastic idea, and I want to commend the Toronto District School Board and Peel Region School Board, and there's a number of school boards, so just because I'm not saying others doesn't mean they're not doing it. They're really taking an active effort in terms of educating their classroom about what is recyclable material. So my brother is a grade 3 teacher, and it's actually part of their curriculum. So I think increasingly the next generation of Canadian recyclers are going to be much more savvy than I ever was. Okay,
so Mazivitis Bardavicius says, what if consumers could pay for packaging and can get their money back when it's recycled? A few countries do it for plastic bottles, but why not try to do that with way more recyclable products? Like, so I guess we're talking about deposit systems here, which are actually pretty widespread for beverage containers across Canada.
Yeah, so beverage containers is a slightly simpler solution in terms of deposit return, meaning I give you a bottle, you reuse it, and it goes back in that bottle, and in theory it goes until the glass breaks or the plastic breaks down. For other packaging choices is that a PET water bottle can be turned into clothing. It could be turned into another PET bottle. It can be turned into pellets that get used for roof shingling. So it's one of those things where the cost of recycling each of those end use products differ. So then what mechanism would there be to actually give the consumer back, because its value is highly contingent on what it gets turned into. So I think the administrative difficulty of figuring that type of system out for non-beverage based systems would be very challenging. Okay. Just as a quick anecdote, they have tried to do that with plastic bags, a deposit return system, and there's not enough data to speak to the efficacy of that system.
All right. Katrina McGuire comments, people have to buy less in general. We have to go back to when convenience wasn't valued over buying locally made goods.
Yeah, and I think so. For those of you who have heard the term reduce, reuse, recycle, it's not just a popular slogan, it's actually the order we should be doing things. So it's called the waste hierarchy. So our foremost responsibility is to reduce our consumption and reduce the amount of waste we put out into the market. But once again, this is enormously challenging in this day and age, and I would be lying bold-faced if I said that I don't appreciate my convenience packaging at times, and I don't use Amazon, I use all of those things. So I think that responsibility, or the onus that a household takes on to say, I'm going to consume less to develop a more sustainable system, it's a very positive message, but I really do think that that responsibility should be placed on packaging producers and not in households. I think households are already doing a fantastic job.
Well, do you think that's something that governments need to get involved in too? Because I don't think packaging producers are going to, they're probably not going to voluntarily say, I'm going to package this in less packaging, even though it might make it not last as long and make it more difficult to transport and not make it look as good on the shelf.
And that's kind of the reality that we live in, is that unless governments intervene through legislation or policy to influence packaging producers to change their packaging choices, they're not going to do it for environmentally altruistic reasons. They're going to make their choices based on what maximizes their bottom line. And in most instances, it's with composite convenience packaging.
Okay, now Christine Blom comments, apartment recycling can be effective. She's found the following methods to be effective: recycling disposal chutes and smaller aesthetic stackable recycling containers on wheeled carts. I would love to see, Christine, a photo of what that looks like. I'm finding it hard to imagine.
Yeah, I haven't seen the second example, the stackable carts. But I think those are wonderful things to highlight, so thank you very much.
Yeah, and well, I mean, we also, some of my colleagues talked to someone who their apartment building their condo building decided to make the garbage chute not for garbage, and they converted it to an organics recycling chute. But I mean, presumably you could do that with change it to recycling too if you wanted to.
Yeah, and so just one final point on that building configuration is that increasingly as they're building new buildings, particularly in Durham region and some other growing communities in Canada, they're now making a recycling provision when they're talking about constructing an apartment building, that there has to be a recycling chute, because we know that it's demonstrably the most effective solution for multi-res, and so now they're going to force builders to implement that.
Oh wow, that's great to hear. Yeah. Oh, Ed Said asks, when I finish a drink, I fold the straw in half and stick it in the plastic bottle. What should really be done with straws?
They shouldn't exist. So unfortunately, straws are a problematic material within the system. It traditionally can't be recycled. So the obvious solution would be try to minimize the use of straws, but recognizing that may not be a feasible solution. What I'd recommend in his particular instance is that don't put it inside the bottle, keep it separate, and unfortunately the straw will end up going to our landfill.
Okay. These are really great questions so far. I think we're getting fairly close to wrapping up, so if anyone has any questions still, I would get them in fairly quickly. We're doing a live Q&A on recycling, and this is our first time doing it through the Reduce, Reuse, Rethink group, and it's really neat. You guys are asking great questions to myself and to Cal Lakhan, who's a prof at York University, or not a prof, a researcher. Yeah, at York University's Department of Environmental Studies. So, let me see what else. We did have some other questions that people had asked here. Let me just have a look. Whoa, that was a very loud motorcycle. Oh, here's one from John Mills. If cities or regions implement laws to eliminate plastic, like Seattle has done, what needs to be done to ensure compostable, biodegradable plastics can actually be composted by these cities and regions? My understanding is that some industrial facilities cannot currently process compostable or biodegradable plastic.
So that's actually a really good point to make. So even though there's a lot of materials that get advertised as being compostable, it's actually highly contingent on a number of environmental factors and climatic factors. So the example I like to think of is the Lay's chip bag that was claimed to be biodegradable. Unfortunately, it was only biodegradable in American landfills that were south of a certain point. For the Canadian landfills, unfortunately, the climate wasn't amenable to having that happen. So I think that the solution has to be a very technical one, in the sense that they have to understand that if you're going to sell this material into a market, understand what are the environmental conditions of that market and whether the recyclability and or composting of that can actually transpire.
Okay. Oh, wait. Oh,
Emergency alert.
That was the emergency alert. I didn't get it the last time, but now apparently...
Hopefully it's just like a test, not a real thing.
All right, well, maybe that's a good signal that we should be wrapping up. And we'll just... does anyone have any last minute questions?
I got one last question.
You have one last question.
Carol, you mentioned about buildings, about newer buildings having mandates. What about the older buildings? Because there's so much old infrastructure.
Yeah.
What can be done in the older buildings to help promote recycling?
So in theory, they can try to implement a try-shoot system, like try to build those chutes, but it's very, very expensive. So the alternative is to work, oh, sirens. Yeah, the alternative is to work with building, okay. So the alternative would be to work with the building managers and supers to make sure that if you have a waste room in these buildings, that it's clean, it's accessible, that it's inviting, that people know it exists. And so it's one of those things where actually a lot of people who live in buildings don't even realize that they have a waste room. They just know, okay, I throw my garbage down a chute, I don't know what happens to my recyclables. And so a lot of the responsibility actually rests with building managers to work with their residents and work with the city to ensure that recycling is transpiring in those buildings.
Okay. So we have a couple last questions, and then we're going to wrap up. Jennifer Breeze asks, what would your advice be for the best way to address waste from clothing and textiles?
Ooh, so this is also a very meaty question. So full disclosure, I'm currently working with Diabetes Canada to develop a national textile strategy.
Oh, wow.
So in a really quick nutshell, my preferred approach, and this is just my opinion, is that municipalities partner with approved charitable organizations to collect textiles. At present, there's no municipality that accepts textiles in their blue bin, and the cost of actually developing those systems so that a MRF can accept textiles is enormous. Presently, there's charities such as Diabetes Canada, Salvation Army, Children's Miracle Network. They already have the infrastructure in place to collect and process this material. And so what we're trying to convince municipalities is that let these charitable organizations assume that responsibility and kick all the bad players out. So the for-profit operators that are fly-by-night and they'll just put up their bin in the back of a Sobeys parking lot, legislate that they're not allowed on municipal property, and to me it's a synergistic effect. Charities benefit because they're receiving money from the sale of that clothing, and the municipality benefits because it's the charities that are actually doing all of the hard work and heavy lifting.
Okay, now we have one last question from Robert Rowlands. I will mention though that after that, if anyone has further questions, feel free to add them in the comments and we'll try to answer them as best we can. So don't worry if you didn't get your question answered. So Robert Rowlands asks, what is the consensus on incineration, which I think also falls into the same category as waste to energy?
Yeah, it's. I don't think there is a consensus. So a lot of European markets classify incineration and waste to energy as a type of diversion, and that's why you see recycling rates in the 90-something%. In Canada, and specifically Ontario, we do not count it as a diversion. So I think if you have a choice of, is this material going to end up in a landfill, or could I potentially use it for waste to energy is preferable. But that should always kind of be the line of last resort. Reduction, recycling should always be considered a preferable alternative, and only if you can't do anything with those materials should you consider waste to energy, because that in and of itself has a significant environmental impact.
Okay, so reducing, reusing, recycling, and then waste to energy.
And then waste to energy. Yeah.
Okay, so that's a great thought to leave on. I think we're just about out of time. So thanks so much, Cal.
Thank you so much
for joining us. This is Cal Lakhan, who's a researcher at York University's Department of Environmental Studies. I'm Emily Chung with CBC News, and this has been our very first Reduce, Reuse, Rethink live Q&A, and the first one we've ever done in within a closed Facebook group. So thank you so much for your great questions. Thank you for joining us, and we hope to do something like this again sometime soon.
Thank you so much, guys.
Thanks.
Take care.